Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the motion be considered read and printed in the record.
Is there objection? So ordered. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, there is no federal agency that has risen to the challenge of innovation over the last 50 years like NASA. When the Soviets put a man into orbit, NASA put men on the moon. We as a nation are today the fortunate heirs of NASA's legacy: conviction, resolve, and achievement. As a Congress, we owe it to NASA to create an environment that promotes creativity rather than one that prevents innovation. Unfortunately, I deeply regret that this House has not fully empowered the men and women of NASA to meet the challenges of our nation in the 21st century. Instead of providing it the tools needed to thrive in energy innovation, the Democratic majority chose to handcuff NASA when it enacted Section 526 of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
Gentleman George is correct. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Section 526 placed an artificial limitation on the ability of federal agencies, including NASA, to utilize alternative fuel sources for their energy needs, even if they could be safely developed within the United States. These domestic energy sources would reduce the cost of fuel and save American taxpayers billions of dollars. While families across the nation pay higher and higher prices for their own fuel needs at the pump, Section 526 ensures that they will also bear the full cost of the federal government's fuel needs, no matter how high they may go. That, Mr. Speaker, is an inconvenient truth that even politicians turned documentary filmmakers can understand. This motion to recommit will provide a waiver for NASA from this misguided provision. It will also foster the American innovative and competitive spirit by putting in place prizes for the private sector to work with domestic sources of energy that are readily available: coal, oil shale, tar sands, and biomass, to develop liquid fuels that will reduce costs. Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
Gentleman's recognized.
Today, nearly a year and a half after Speaker Pelosi promised the American people a common-sense plan to bring down gas prices, the price of a gallon of gasoline is $4.08. This marks an increase of $1.75 since the beginning of the 110th Congress, a nearly 75% increase since the Democrats took over control, in a premium that is wrecking this economy. Since we are the people's house, one might presume that the Democrats would listen to the American people. However, the 20% of Americans who favor suing our way to lower gas prices have trumped the nearly 60% of Americans who favor domestic drilling. Perhaps this is motivated out of a deference to the trial lawyers and environmental extremist groups who are, shall we say, closely tied to the Democratic caucus. Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
Gentleman is entitled to be heard. Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, this same establishment is preventing us today from extracting oil shale in the western United States, in which an estimated 1.2 trillion barrels of petroleum is trapped in porous shale rock, of which 70% of that is on public federal land. That's exactly where it's going to stay, trapped, as long as Section 526 remains intact. Whatever action this Congress does take, a repeal of Section 526 is in order, or at the very least a waiver. Grant a waiver, as this motion to recommit proposes, so that we do not hinder progress at the very agency that has been on the cutting edge of technology for these last 50 years. But time after time, in the committee rooms of the House, in the Rules Committee, and on the floor of this body, my Democratic colleagues have refused to address Section 526 in any meaningful way. And let me point out, Mr. Speaker, the Lamson Amendment does virtually nothing. It only allows us to continue importing oil from Canada, our largest source of imported oil, because it might contain just a little trace of petroleum that was obtained from tar sands. That's all that does. If this Congress insists on sacrificing American competitiveness and innovation on the altar of environmental extremism, then it will be one small step for NASA, but one giant leap for Greenpeace. Mr. Speaker, this is about more than the pain at the pump. It's also about the spirit of discovery and innovation that's the backbone of our great nation. The decisions we make today will not only impact this generation, but generations to come. We can either provide American engineers and innovators the tools they need to realize limitless opportunities for the American people, or this majority can continue to put up arbitrary roadblocks that stymie their potential.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Tennessee, what purpose do you rise?
In opposition to the motion.
Gentleman's recognized.